us about the fact that this path, the path of contemplation, we've been doing these 15 different archetypes, these life paths. This life path seems to be often least popular for people. Often when they go through these paths and ask them which one they want to explore first, they say, oh, let's explore the path of adventure, the path of combat and everything. And it's not necessarily the most appealing one to talk about the path of contemplation. But Jonas just said that actually for him, it is probably one of the ones that has the most appeal. What did you have in mind, Jonas, when we talk about the path of contemplation?
Well, I was just thinking about the benefits of when you find your own way to do this and to apply some of these principles, because it actually feels really good in a different way. Like this one is really also about a shift in how you're thinking, not just what you're doing and your concrete actions and the steps. And there's really something about another level, which very quickly then verges into the spiritual questions or the philosophical questions. But if we keep it at the practical of what happens when you step out of slashing through your to-do list and you actually manage to put yourself in a state of mind where really anything that needs to be done and you're just an observer and you feel just at peace with whatever's going on. That sounds super cliche. It sounds potentially like not very exciting, or like it doesn't actually feel good. But when you actually manage to implement it regularly, it really it's like creating these little buffers, these little breathing spaces in the rat race that is life. So yeah, I mean, breathing doesn't seem that sexy, but it feels pretty good. And if you don't do it, you die. So yeah, I think for me, contemplation and meditation is one of those where it's easy um, not to assess the benefits that it can really bring, and it's easy to slip into these cliches. And we were talking before this about thought motorways, like the big ready to wear thoughts that people have, le prêt-à-penser, a lot of that goes on the topic of meditation and contemplation. I mean, I think if you stop 10 people in the street and you ask them, okay, what comes to your mind if I tell you meditation or contemplation, they'll imagine like a group of middle-aged people in lycra stretching, and maybe vaguely appropriating someone's culture, and making it pseudo-spiritual. But in practice, meditation can be what you do when you're at the gym. It can be something that you do in any environment. It doesn't have to be sit down, close your eyes, and think of nothing. So that's why I was saying that for me, it's one of those interesting topics, actually.
And the path of contemplation is one of those 15. So it's just to reframe, if you're watching this episode first time and you haven't seen these other 14 episodes, is that we're doing a series of 15 on this archetype wheel, which is like a coloring mandala. And the idea behind this was developed initially as a personal reflection tool that I did for coloring in. And this is an example of one on my desk that I did recently, where I color in one color what I've been in the past, what I've experienced as an archetype. And an archetype can be a symbolic role that you play with others. Like a typical archetype could be the warrior, which doesn't mean you have to fight. It just means you take that posture in your life. And you usually combine multiple archetypes. And in this case, the archetypes that we're going to unpack are those three. Each path has three, starting from the middle, going outwards. The first one is the sort of more internal archetype, focus on self. Second one, focusing on the outside world. And the third one is the archetype where you put the two first ones together and master that path with the sacred practice at the end of that path. So, and the reason we're doing these with Jonas, my brother, is a therapist, is that we wanted to invite people to think outside of the box when they're rethinking their career choices, their hobbies, or just meditating or reflecting on their life and thinking like, what could I experience that's outside of the box of my work and my hobbies? If I combine these different archetypes, I could take three of them and say, how might I embody this with this with this in my life? What could I do differently? And so today we're looking at the path of contemplation. And if I zoom in a second so you can see a little bit more what this means, the path of contemplation is literally the word contemplation denotes this idea of almost being content, being sort of content within. And there's the first one that we're going to look at is the witness, that's focused on interiority. And it just occurred to me, Jonas, that I don't know if you remember from school in France a few years ago, maybe it was just before you went through those primary school days, there was a point at which in France they started to try and teach meditation. It was an utter failure, but they tried to teach contemplation, and they called it la gestion mentale. Do you remember that? Is that something that you had in school, Jonas? Like la gestion mentale?
No, I missed out on that one. I had other good ones, but no, I think that says something about the French institutional approach to things. Let's take
Yeah,
this thing. There's evidence that meditation works. Let's
yeah.
force it down the throats of children, and let's take the angle control. Like gestion is really to manage. Like let's manage your minds, kids. So yeah, I
Yeah.
can only imagine how that went. Yeah.
So la gestion mentale in French schools, this was at one point they tried to implement this, but their main problem was that teachers didn't know how to do it, so it was very difficult for them to teach it forward, and it became exactly as you said, it was a control thing. So the path of contemplation is really an invitation to first, before starting to make it all spiritual and all just really about witnessing, just paying attention, looking, for example, at your thought process. As a therapist, Jonas, you probably have plenty of times when you recommend people to take a step back and to just witness their interiority or their interior thought processes and how things unfold without judging, without trying to evaluate or control it, but just paying attention to that thought flow going through there. When was the last time you recommended in one of your therapy sessions for somebody to focus on their interior thought patterns?
I mean, last time I worked, Saturday, I actually often give reflection questions to invite them to look at a specific question. So the first one that comes to mind is I'm working with this couple that's been through a lot, and it's still going through a lot. And at some point, the question poses itself. They were describing a situation where I think the guy phrased it as we both expect and need stuff from each other that we're not able to give each other.
Mm-hmm.
Introduction to the session. I knew I was in for a great hour. So this then invites the question, knowing them, are there any good reasons not to break up? Because at some point, often my job is to voice the elephant in the room and to be able to give the safety to be able to have the difficult conversations and to talk about the thing that they're avoiding talking about the rest of the time, at least in a controlled environment for 1 hour. So, for example, that was a concrete question that I invited them to reflect on, along with a few other ones. I think one was, is time enough to fix things? To what degree is that assumption that just waiting things out is going to produce an effect? What is the effect that we anticipate just waiting to actually do? Are there any factors besides waiting that we can identify that would? So, really, I'm not telling them what to do. I'm really encouraging them in that moment. This is an interesting question to ask yourself in those moments where you're not doing the thing, you're not having the conversation with your partner. But if I'm correct, I think the etymology of contemplation is really observing. I think it's from the contemplare. I think I'd have to check. Let's just give me a second. I'm just going to check the etymology, but I'm pretty sure it's actually it directly means to observe.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And while you're looking at this, I think one of the ways I look at this archetype is when a person is coloring that in. I think most people have been at some point focusing on their interior world, but the archetype of witnessing goes a little bit beyond just actually meditating. It goes to being identifying yourself as a witness. So you could be a witness as a therapist, like you do. You're witnessing, for example, a breakup in a couple or re coming together. But there's also the witness in the very, without going into the work bubble, you could go into the play bubble, or you go to walk in the forest with a friend, and they're having a difficult conversation. You have a presence in talk where you talk without giving the judgment or an advice, and you just listen to hold space. Then you could also be then in that archetype of a witness. So people who've been through the Green Elephant trainings, for example, have learned about how to do presencing, which is a conversation format where you're not trying to fix a person's problems, you're just empathically giving space to them. That is a form of the archetype of witnessing somebody's thought processes and giving them space to not feel judged and to work through their own things is also the archetype of witnessing. It doesn't have to be something very professional. It can also happen in a family context when the mother is talking about her childhood and so on, and just witnessing that and focusing on what does it feel like inside. Am I feeling gratitude? Am I feeling anger? What is it emerging inside of me? What is it bringing up inside of me? And that is essentially how I sort of construe the witness archetype. And in that way, I really color that in, not just as a past, as a present, but also as I want that more in the future. So I color it in all three colors to bring that, because it's an essential breathing space, as you said before. What did you find on the etymology? Did you find something that was,
So it
because I
does
thought
come
it was
from.
content. Is it?
No, actually, it comes from Latin. I was completely wrong about the Latin it comes from. I said contemplare, which is probably just Italian, so my bad. It actually comes from the Latin templum, which is the place of observation, which probably gave temple. Then
Mm,
contemplari, and then contemplat, which is surveyed, observed, contemplated. Um, so there's really this place. It comes originally from a place of observation. That's the root of the word. So it
very
and
accurate in this context.
it's actually I think the most one of the most important dimensions of the witness level is separating the observing from the doing. It's taking the time. That's often also what makes a sacred practice sacred. If you look at this as a spiritual path, is that you step out of the mundane and you go to the
Mm,
level of divine observation. You go and you look at things from a higher plane or from a different angle. So
mhm.
already you can color that one in if you at any point in any way step away from doing and reflect, or even not even reflect like take notes, but just observe instead of doing. Let's imagine you're a
Mm.
fisherman, and instead of arriving and starting to fish, you arrive at the river and you observe for a few minutes before doing anything. That counts as being a witness. You're not actually just doing and
Is that
thinking
how
and observing at
you
the same
started
time.
contemplation then? Is fishing, or was it gardening? Which one was the one that you started contemplating in most?
Neither one actually. I think the first one was really just a garden. I just
Yeah.
remember spending hours in sitting in trees listening to music in Bum, the family
Mm,
house we had in the south of France. Yeah, I
mm,
think for me it's nature. That's the first thing. Watching animals. You know, when you're a kid and you have the ability to just watch a duck and just be amazed by everything that's going on, and you understand. You're like reading it. It's like a story. And now, often when you're an adult and you just see a duck, you're just not really that amazed anymore. But I think
yeah.
all of those little micro situations, I think that was the first thing that I really stopped to really witness.
Yeah. So you would be able to color in that I've done this kind of color, and then would you now change what you contemplate on? What's your main contemplation today if you take that archetype?
Uh, I think it's still nature now. It's really part of my routine in the morning and in the evening in the garden. Um, but now I do it really deliberately. I know that it's part of my um, mental health checklist. You know, for myself.
Mm,
If I don't have enough moments where I'm in that contemplative state of mind, I notice that my irritability increases, my ability to enjoy things decreases, I start to lose a bit of focus, and I just feel like I'm being pressed constantly pressed for everything and anything. So for me, yeah, it's really in those little moments, in those bio breaks, to try and just observe something. And if it's not something nice on the outside, I'll put on music that I know is going to elicit a certain train of thought. And then I'll observe that train of thought, like kind of contemplate the own little daydream that I'm kind of building and witnessing at the same time. So sometimes it's observing something on the outside, sometimes it's trying to observe something on the inside, and sometimes it's actively producing what you're observing. It's like if you look at the ways in which you can use your attention, you have the types of meditation where it's about letting go of the focus and trying to have the broadest focus possible. Or it can be the ones where you're trying to hyper focus on something and you try to not lose that focus. Um, and it's often interesting to play around with those different ones. Sometimes you're actively trying to think of something, like you're visualizing um, a goal that you have, or you're visualizing
mm,
something that's comforting. You're visualizing your safe space. I don't know. and to be able to stay fixated on that without straying away, that's also a form of meditation. People often think meditation is thinking of nothing.
When you're talking to patients in a therapy practice context, like how do you bring that topic forward without the defense that often happens around these topics? Like, is it do you explain it, or do you name it and label it, or how do you approach that?
I often use the accusation audit technique
Mm,
for the ones that know it. So you probably think that meditation is sitting down and doing nothing while thinking about nothing. Or you might think that meditation is something you have to go and do, in a gym where you pay, blah, 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 blah. But I try to build from what I've already noticed people tend to do that is semi-contemplative. Like
mm,
people will tell you like, oh yeah, like when I come home from work, I like to sit down, before I even turn on the television or something. I'll just have a beer, and I'll just kind of let my day run through my mind. That's already a form of contemplation right there.
yeah.
So I try to build from what they already do, and I really try to build from an intrinsic motivation. If I have a patient who's a keen swimmer, I'll channel that topic through those themes, and I'll try to get them
Hmm.
to notice how they're thinking when they're actually swimming, and potentially suggest, well, when you finish your swimming session where you've already feel like you've already experienced these principles of flow, for example, that now would be a good time to do this and this type of meditation for this type of purpose. But the thing is, you really have to work from the why, because meditation isn't a fix it all, it isn't a silver bullet. And for some people, it's an extremely distressing experience to have that sit down and just like face whatever's going on the inside. For some people, that's actively dangerous.
Mm,
People that have extremely high levels of anxiety, people that have very low emotional regulation mechanisms, people that are in acute distress. Like, I don't know, let's
mm,
imagine you've just had terrible news and you just found out one of your relatives died, and in that moment you're not going to go and meditate, like most people, except if you're already an advanced practitioner, it's probably not a good idea to just immediately go there and just like, okay, I'm going to focus on death right now, and really let it sink in. I'm going to accept this experience. You're just going to freak yourself out. So you really have to tailor it to the person and to a specific purpose, because there
mm,
isn't a meditation, it's meditations. So
yeah.
it's, yeah, case
S-
specific.
and 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 so if we go back to the path, like on the path, the first archetype is the witness, which focuses on the interiority. But then as we go to the second archetype on the circle, which is generally the yang or the external archetype, the one focused on the outside world, there the archetype is the monk, which could be labeled differently, of course, because the monk has a sort of religious connotation, but actually the monk is more of a posture towards using that contemplation in everyday life in activities that could be mundane or professional. So, for
Mm.
instance, you could take a monk like attitude or monk archetype. Like, if we think back to conscious communication, when we do these conflict boot camps where we train people to deal with really difficult conflicts, difficult situations, difficult conversations, and helping them to sort of deal with that using conscious communication, well, then you become almost like a monk of communication, because you're not going within, you're not blocking the outside world, you're going back to the world, you're entering, engaging with people, whether it's at work in a conflict or at home in a conflict, for example. You are actively engaging in that world while staying on that contemplative posture. So we could call that staying conscious. And one thing I kind of wanted to highlight is that recently, when we talked about conscious communication, a lot of people said to me, oh, but isn't that just metacognition? Like thinking about thinking, stepping back and thinking about how you're thinking. Or metacognitive communication would be then thinking about how you're communicating, not just doing it, not just doing it on autopilot, but actually stepping back and going, like, when I said that, this triggered internal anxiety and triggered the person opposite into a worse conflict. What happened? So I think the main difference between the witness and the monk is that the monk is able, probably through enough practice, probably through enough internal confidence, that they can take that witnessing to the outside world and stay on that witnessing, even though things, like you're driving in traffic, you can still be a monk, driving in traffic in Marseille when everybody is being difficult around you. You can start actually still being like, oh, okay, I'm witnessing that there's an anger bubbling up inside of me right now when they cut me off and so on. So, what would be a good reflection question, Jonas, around that second archetype when somebody who maybe has already practiced witnessing and some form of meditation through hobby or spiritual practices and is ready to take that into the outside world? What would be a good reflection question based on your therapy experience that could help people in that archetype of the monk?
I'd be tempted to tie it back to a why again. So
Mm,
why am I witnessing anything? Why am I contemplating anything? And why am I using any of these tools to what end? And then to really map out the different things that you could be paying attention to on the outside and on the inside. So you could be focusing on the internal structure of yourself, what's going on inside of you, how you deal with certain specific situations. So the advanced level would be to really collect data, so you have something to observe and to contemplate. So either to really go out and put yourself in a certain environment outside. For example, I realize that I probably need to regulate stress more and have more positive emotions. What is an area, for example, is it more beneficial for me to go and meditate in the forest, or
mm,
is it better for me to go out and dance, and enter a musical trance on a Saturday night with my friends? What brings me the best benefit, and to approach it in that systematic way, to map it out and to treat it like a research project. So focus on, yeah, mapping out these different areas of contemplation with it inside of you. It could also be patterns. What is something that I feel that always happens to me? What is something that I feel again and again? If I went back and I had to look for some of the roots of these patterns in my early experiences, um, how what can I observe of the story I told myself about those things, etc., etc. Mapping beliefs. It's kind of hard to do by yourself, to realize yourself what you believe. But it's a very interesting exercise. Like when you manage to do that on, let's imagine that you have a specific situation, something relates to work. Like I often have conflicts with my superiors or people that are in positions of authority or that I perceive to be in positions of authority. Um, where is that coming from? Why do I never have conflicts like that with my subordinates or with my equals? Um, Interesting to go and observe back in the past. And maybe last point on this would be, yeah, really the question of purpose. Because if we're looking at the optimal situation, the best case scenario, probably someone would be active regularly and doing a lot of stuff, but really because they found something that makes sense to them and it's really strongly linked to an intrinsic motivation. That really it helps us to feel the best and to give our best as well. These external rewards, a fat paycheck, prestige, whatever rocks your boat, typically it doesn't produce the same beneficial effects. So if we're thinking about how can I really use this path of contemplation to yield the maximum well-being and health in the whole system, it's probably interesting to help you really figure out why the hell are you getting up in the morning and doing anything. Because if you find something that really has a strong enough why to it, it'll help you to push through the frustrations, the learning curves, the disappointments, and it'll actually really give you the best rewards, as
mm.
opposed to a fat paycheck where, I mean, yeah, you can treat yourself to nice stuff with that, but it doesn't bring you meaning in itself.
So there's a fundamental level of meaning finding, path finding of the meaning, giving meaning to something, which I think isn't that related to logotherapy and the whole Viktor Frankl giving meaning choicefully, just not being the
Yeah.
victim of the meaning given, but actually saying no, I choose to give this meaning. Um,
Yeah.
One thing
Yes.
that just occurred to me when I go to the mystic, which is the last one, the mastery, where you balance the inner and the outer, the inner witness and the outer monk, is spiritual ego. I'm talking about this a lot at the moment at the moment I'm working a lot in the music industry. I'm talking with musicians with artists, with people who support and coach musicians, often the topic of ego comes back, like, as if it was a bad thing. You know, everybody has an ego. The way we talk about ego in this context, obviously, is that it's just identity that's formed by comparison, like better or worse than somebody, faster or slower, more or less followers on social media. That's all basically ego through comparison. Now, the challenge I've been seeing with, particularly when somebody labels themselves as a mystic, and a mystic doesn't have to be calling themselves a mystic. It's just somebody who is actively taking that contemplation, meditation posture in the public domain and in social media, saying, you know, I am conscious. Then what often I notice is that they tend to create spiritual ego, meaning that they start to compare themselves about how conscious am I? And it just reminded me of Alan Watts when in one of his beautiful talks, where he starts saying it's like it's a constant game of one-upmanship in the spiritual level, where I am holier than you, I am more spiritual than you, and then it becomes actually no longer contemplation. It becomes just a form of ego and comparison again. So I think there's a trap with this path and these archetypes, is that if one wants to really explore these archetypes, there's a point at which it's good to let go of that ego, that identification about how well am I contemplating, how well am I conscious, and am I doing it, you know, am I doing it more or less than my neighbor? Am I feeling superior because I'm more conscious and mystical than the others around me? And that, I think, is often a trap in the arts, where people tend to, I am channeling this divine influence and creativity that it's not me, but it is kind of me. You know, there's this kind of very ambiguous ego, spiritual ego, that pops in. What would be a good way, from, you've probably seen that a number of times in some of your therapy sessions, what would be a good, like, question or thing to look out for to avoid falling into that, Jonas?
I think it's really about where you're placing the focus. If you're placing the focus on how other people are going to be seeing you, how you want to be seen by them, and how you see them, if the focus is outward in that quest, then it exposes you a lot to that risk, because it becomes about demonstrating and proving. But if you don't care about people, why do people need to know you're a mystic? Why do
Mm,
people need to know what you contemplate? Why are you sharing that information? Why are you making that a broadcasted part of your identity?
mm,
Um, in many respects, faith can be kept to oneself, not because it's a bad thing that you can't talk about and that could trigger people, but because in some respects it doesn't need to be shared with other people. So a good way to maybe prevent some of that from happening is to meditate on the question of what needs to be displayed versus what needs to be kept to oneself. And came across some interesting ideas on that recently on the topic of goal setting. Um, Actually, something I heard on the Huberman Lab podcast episode on that topic. He'll give you the scientific data, the actual reference for the paper that studied this. But the idea was, many studies have shown that if you tell someone about a goal that you have, and that they kind of support you and encourage you and hype you up, it actually diminishes the likelihood of you reaching that goal. So there's a case to be made for, don't tell people about your projects, tell people about when you've actually reached your objective. But until then, keep it to yourself, or ask someone that you know is a critic and is actually going to try and discourage you, because that can actually turn into motivation more than someone actually supporting you. So if you've got a very important project at work, don't go home and tell your missus, your partner, or your mum and expect them, and hope for them to tell you, that's great, honey, you're going to make it, you're going to be the best, you're going to nail that presentation tomorrow. Keep it to yourself until you've nailed the presentation and then report back. Much safer for goal setting. But yeah, back to the level of mystic. If we look at the etymology of that one, I think it relates back to the mysteries. There were several religions or several
mm,
branches of wisdom where they had these kind of like mysteries, these sacred knowledges, wisdoms, ideas, and practices, and
mm,
only a select number of people were initiated into the mystery
mm,
and became practitioners and had significant power, influence, or just wisdom. So I think there is from the moment you arrive at this level, there becomes emerges a clear distinction between the ones that are initiated into these higher truths and the ones that are not. And I think that that's where the ego pitfall can very quickly come in, is if you think that if you think you have access to some of these higher truths because you've been studying them for years and you've read all the books and you've done all the meditations, well, to remind yourself that that doesn't give you more value than anyone else. It just means that you have maybe a richer story that you're telling yourself about whatever's going on, but in no way does that give you power innately on anyone else. So yeah, I think, but it is an interesting thing to reflect on, that because when you look at different religions, and I'm sure you've done this yourself, Estève, it's amazing to see the overlap when you go to the essential level, when you go back to the creation myths, when you go back to the story of mankind, how it was created, when you go back to the stories about our nature, about how to regulate situations. A lot of religion served as a kind of form of law back in the day. So and it's amazing to see how much similarity comes back at the really essential level. So an interesting idea that they might be these mysteries that we can have access to if we observe the right things and draw the right conclusions. But yeah, who knows?
There's actually, now that you put that on the table, it just reminds me when I was 19, I was living up in Briançon in the French Alps, and I walked across the street, saw this old bookstore, and found completely by accident, maybe call it serendipity, this book called Les Grands Initiés des Darchourés, The Great Initiates. And the book caught my attention because on the back cover, it explained that it's one of the first books that talks about the similarities between all these spiritual currents, as opposed to the differences, which if you talk to any scholar, they'll generally do a lot of work around showing how they're different, how their religion or spiritual traditional is different and better than others and more valid. And that book that I had stumbled upon accidentally started to talk about, actually, no, there's so many similarities. And this is how each of these initiates had in common and shared their messages through time, and how it echoed, and it had a slightly different emphasis in one culture or another, but they actually had the very same core message, and all that was different is the way, in the context in which they were, what was emphasized was slightly different. And that for me was really the beginning of this quest towards a more mystical view of life, where the mysteries were not mysteries because now we can read and we can access those so-called sacred texts that were at one point only reserved to an elite of educated and wealthy, or perhaps monks. And nowadays, actually, anybody who's curious can open a book, and who can read can open a book and start looking at these different mystical traditions. And what occurred to me is that the energy that we spend at trying to demonstrate how this is different is often just a complete waste of time, when we could just look at, I remember having a great conversation with a Muslim friend who was talking about the Quran, and another Christian friend talking about the Bible, and talking a third person who was a Buddhist. And when we dropped this whole idea of how they're different and started going to the universal principles of, what is it to be a human being? How do you contemplate? And what does your spiritual tradition tell you about that? We actually found so much more common ground than is generally accepted in the motor way of thinking of society. So to me, the mystic, I think, is an invitation. The archetype has always been an invitation to cut the crap around how we're different and comparing, and just focus on that first-hand experience of receiving what's going on in that present moment. Right there's something happening. Am I noticing, or am I filtering it through my past limiting beliefs and my past experiences? Or am I right there in the present moment, focusing and receiving, hence the word receptivity? So that's how I started looking into it. And often it's exactly as you said, it's not something that you necessarily need to advertise and say, hey, I'm a mystic. I remember seeing two people in social media in Finland here who were very open-minded and very conversational, and then at some point something happened. They traveled, they came back, and their whole social media was about preaching. One of them became very, very Christian, the other one became very Muslim, but either way they were both sort of, their whole posting was about, I'm a mystic, follow me, look, I'm doing it well, I'm doing it right. And almost like if they were trying to reassure themselves that they're doing it, rather than actually getting on with it and showing by example that their attitude to life and their posture towards human to human interactions and relationships has shifted towards something more spiritual. So I think there's a trap in these three archetypes. The trap is to try and tell people and trying to show off that contemplation, which by essence, the whole idea of contemplation is to just step back and witness and not try and compare and judge and all this. So it's a very powerful path that often people tell me, oh, I'm not sure I get this one. I think I'll leave this one out. I'll do that when I'm old. Let me focus on the other archetypes. But actually, it's probably a very useful one to start cultivating and to start combining with other archetypes. How could we combine? Oh, you could combine the monk, the mystic, or the witness with another archetype, which would be, well, since the cat's here, let's take that one, the path of nature, contemplating animals. You could be, for example, working with animals and contemplating them rather than just trying to heal them. Like if you're a vet, you could be, using that healer archetype, one, then the path of nature, contemplating nature around us and animals, and three, the monk being conscious and being sort of contemplative around the animals, just like you're doing now. So there's plenty of ways that you can combine these archetypes with others and have a flavor of contemplation with any of the other archetypes.
Mm.
What would be a good sort of wrapping up for this path is having a little look at the meditation practice. So
Yes.
if we think of, like, I'm, middle-aged man, I've done my share of trying to meditate. Now I'm coming to you for advice as to a therapist, Jonas. Like, what would you say to me if I'm struggling with meditation? I'm struggling with that interiority. As you said earlier, I'm going in my witnessing and I get this anxiety. What would you say to me now as like the very first step to cultivate that path of contemplation and meditation? With step one.
So why are you meditating?
To change the feeling of some of the internal feelings that could be related to stress or anxiety at work.
So you're trying to experience something of a feeling of peace, something of a feeling that's a sensation in your body that's pleasant, and you're probably trying to deal with the removal of some intrusive, unpleasant thoughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to achieve that, you are when you're meditating, what do you do? What are you observing?
Well, I've tried a few things, but right now my main practice is musical. So if I really want to go into that, I'm either listening to audiobooks, people that I kind of help me get into the meditative flow, such as Alan Watts or Course in Miracles, something like that, or then I listen to music. And I have playlists that I create that are contemplative, that are not there to try and find the right talent if I'm working with musicians, but really just like I let myself flow into that music and I contemplate thanks to the music, possibly looking at something outdoors.
Yeah. How much impact do you feel that is having on the physiological state that you're trying to change? Like, does it work well enough?
I think it does. The only thing is that I feel like I'm cheating because I'm using a prop, like music.
Where is the rule book on meditation that you're referring yourself to?
True that. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, maybe it's because that mental model that I have, that's like you described earlier, that idea that meditation happens, sitting in lotus position on a rock in
It
the middle
can't
of
be. It can't
nowhere.
feel too good. It can't be that fun, and it has to be
No,
without
it has
external
to be
props, right?
painful. Yeah, maybe
Right.
that's what it is.
Yeah. I mean, it just on that small example, I think you're already doing. You've already found something that works. You're just judging yourself, and that's making you question it.
Mm.
But that already seems like you found something that works well enough for you. Additional things that you might want to consider, really, in terms of monitoring yourself, but having more of those exercises that are more like a practical meditation, like qigong, tai chi,
Mm.
where you're
Mm.
focusing on your breathing, not your thoughts.
Mm.
You're channeling your thoughts to focus on your breathing and to connect with your body in a different way, and then using those energies and all sorts of other visualizations. I'm not well informed enough to be able to give you a very detailed breakdown of how to do that, but I would encourage you to go and explore in that direction, because that would technically be something that meets the same end as what you were describing. And another little thing is, if you're trying to deal with intrusive thoughts, imagine that there's incompressible amount of time that your mind has decided it's going to have to treat this as a problem, you don't get to choose if you confront it, you just get to choose when you confront it. So either you avoid it consciously and it comes back at the times where you don't want to think about it, or
Mm,
you bite the bullet and you attack it consciously in blocks sometimes, and actually you make it go down much quicker. So this is why I would actually recommend not meditation per se, but journaling, to really empty the septic tank and make sure that you're supporting your inner parent and your inner child with your inner adult, and that you're actually having one of those internal meetings where you're like, okay, Estève, apparently this is an issue. So who's the one in the room that's screaming the loudest? Is it a should or is it a want? And okay,
yeah.
apparently this time it's a should. Okay,
Mm,
and etc. etc. But yeah, having the you don't necessarily have to just observe your thoughts to get those benefits. You can observe something on the outside, like the music. You can
mm,
absolutely do whatever it takes to get your mind in that space. Word of caution for psychedelics and substances as a way to like meditate. Uh, it's not that it doesn't give you benefits and that it destroys the purpose of it, but if you're too dependent on something that's that powerful of an external clutch, it's very hard for then you to have that ability in your day-to-day life and to not become dependent on that crutch.
mm,
And also, some of these are pretty strong. Like if we're looking at different levels of reality that you can look at, and
mm,
if you're looking at this as an opportunity to kind of recreate the narrative and rewrite the story day by day, and kind of have some agency over the story you tell yourself about
mm,
what the hell is going on and why are we here. Well, if you take something, let's imagine you're a young, like 20 something year old, um, and you decide, like, you've read all these books and you decide, okay, I'm going to go and drop acid in the woods, and that's going to fast track my spiritual growth. I'm going to meet whatever's out there. You know, it's going to be great. Well, I mean, some people have good experiences and will reach that end, but for other people, it's kind of breaking the fabric of reality a little bit too much, too violently, and in a way that's not necessarily safe. Like it can actually be very, very disturbing when you have a bad trip under some of these psychedelic substances.
mm, mm.
So nowadays we're in an age where they're starting to be used for medicinal purposes. They're studied again more. They've come out of
Biohacking is a
these,
huge. I mean, right now there's a big trend in the
yeah,
biohacking community of microdosing, and a lot of people are advocating that also for personal growth.
yeah.
So I think what you're talking to speaks to that as well.
And let's just be careful. It's not because something shouldn't be criminalized that it's automatically safe and that everyone should be doing it.
Mm,
Anytime you're taking a mind altering substance, it has consequences and it can have
mm,
long lasting consequences. So, just a word of caution, it's not being stuck up and too conservative to be cautious when it comes to some of these substances. I'm all for a controlled, intelligent use in a clinical setting or in a legal setting for some of these substances. But yeah, let's just be careful with trying to fast track spiritual growth with ayahuasca
mm,
mushrooms. Like I have patients that do that, and the effect, literally something that was told by a patient last week, the effect doesn't last. Tantra courses feels great for 2 weeks. Reality kicks back in.
mm.
Same pain points come back. Um, Trip with Bufo, this kind of like psychoactive, really strong revelation, like cliche spiritual retreat, walking around naked, feeling like Jesus, his words, not mine, and then coming back and 2 weeks later, feeling depressed again. So they in themselves are not enough. And so in his case, we're working on like trying to get therapy to address some of these bigger underlying issues to bring about some of these changes. So there's space for a tantra retreat and for maybe like ayahuasca if that's what he chooses, but that it actually doesn't just bring this radical change back to zero, radical change back to zero kind of a thing. So
Mm.
yeah, word of caution.
Well, I think it's a great point that you add that in, because in the contemplation, I hear this a lot. In the biohacking community, people talking very highly about using substances to try and contemplate better, and yeah, there is definitely that possible dependency, and the whole fake reality that you kind of have two different levels of reality that you're not connecting. and bringing it back to the everyday life, which is the monk archetype, actually, is being able to really bring it to that everyday life of contemplating on everyday life when you're in the car, on the bike, in the bus, in the meeting, and in those everyday mundane situations. So as a wrap up, like for this path of contemplation, which is starting from the archetype of the witness, interiority. Me, myself, my focus is on what's going on inside. Monk, focus on the outside, but still keeping that conscious detachment from it and not judging it. And third is the combination of both, where you're really focused on receiving whatever is without judging it. And that can be called meditation in some way, and it can have its drawbacks if we start getting too deep into it, either through substances or through manic use of some spiritual messaging and going deep into that and identifying with spiritual ego to being a mystic or a monk or a witness, instead of actually just keeping it as a personal practice that is a posture towards oneself. So I think this now concludes those 15 life paths. We've done all of those different life paths one by one. Each one has been a video that we've done one at a time with a few questions, reflection questions. Like as a closing for this, because this is our last recording for this series, Jonas, like what would be your, out of all these different life paths, which is the life path right now that you are the most engaged in actively experiencing? Because we've been through these 15. And I'll do the same as a checkout.
That's a good one. Yeah, I think the healing, definitely. Yeah, that's because of my job and the kind of posture that I have in a lot of relationships. It's very much the healing arts, the path of family, essentially, and then nature. I think ecology.
So combining the healing, the nature.
Yeah. Although actually no, let me the healing, and I think actually in a way kind of the warrior, the martial arts in a way.
Path of combat there.
Yeah. It's like a I'm like if I just had the image of, in the video games you have the combat medic, but I'm like the combat medic shaman in the woods. It's a weird combination. But I'm a weird person. I'm at peace with that, so it's fine.
Weird with a Y as opposed to with a EI, with the old, look it up.
Depends on who you ask.
and for me it would be at the moment it would be the path of contemplation, which we talked about today, the path of relation, and the path of healing. Because I'm noticing that I would definitely add a little twist of the path of beauty when I bring in the music field, working with music as a form of healing of relationships between people and contemplation. I've noticed this in the music industry. A lot of music is often labeled as something of entertainment, but I'm seeing it quite a spiritual tool to help people connect with themselves while connecting with others and bring in a bit of healing in their relations with each other. So I'm looking at those, and maybe then, if you're doing this exercise of coloring in these different parts, the obvious purpose of this is to then take multiple parts, like take, for example, like you did, Jonas, the healer, the path of nature, the wild man, and the path of combat, where you could be the warrior or the hunter. You could take those three archetypes and put them into a creative question. For example, if you're watching this as a coach and that you're coaching somebody or you're coaching yourself, you can take this, turn it into a coaching creative question, such as how might I experience being a healer, a wild man, and a nomad, or a warrior in this case, path of combat, in a way that I've never experienced before. And take that question, sit with it, journal on it, even ask a few people around you that know you more or less, and see what kind of things they come up with. Why not even throw it to ChatGPT and say, like, how could I combine these three archetypes? Any ideas? Often what happens is that it opens up a completely new horizon that wasn't obvious when we're stuck in our usual box thinking that is conditioned by work and hobbies. So this is the invitation to you watching these videos, is to not just color them in as a reflection, which is a contemplation in itself, but also to take a combination of those archetypes and put them together into a creative question with how might I embody these 1, 2, 3, 4 archetypes in a new way? What could I experience differently? What could that be? And use that as a brainstorm with people or with an AI, and see how that brings you to the next step in your life. So Jonas, thank you. We will be doing another season on a different topic, most likely next year. We will be doing something. I'll keep that as a surprise. We'll reveal that in social channels. But thank you for this year's 15 series that we've done since last September. And may your contemplation of nature, healing, and warriorship combine very beautifully. And have a nice end of Monday.
Thank you. And thank you for hosting this. And yeah, I look forward to continuing in the future and seeing what other random, deep meta conversations we can have about life, and hopefully people get something out of it.
Yeah.